Here we are again. Today we're going to work on Chapter 1-4, Properties of Real Numbers. You're going to learn about identities, the multiplicative property of 0, and just a little bit about the commutative, the associative, and the distributive properties. So here we go. This next chapter, or next section in this chapter is Section 4, Properties of Real Numbers. And we're only going to discuss a few because this section itself does not discuss them all. You'll get more of them later on in Chapter 1, so we'll stick with the textbook order. First, we'll start with identities. Identities are simply those rules that you enjoyed most when you learned how to add and when you learned how to multiply. For example, 4 times 1 equals 4. That is an example of what's called the multiplicative, because we're multiplying, the multiplicative identity. When you multiply by 1, you get the same number back. So the generic version of that might be a times 1 equals 1 times a equals a. In other words, you can multiply any value by 1 and it doesn't change its value. That would be, as you see with multiplication symbols, that's the multiplicative identity. There's also the additive identity. 4 plus, now you wouldn't use 4 plus 1, 4 plus 0 equals 4. So there's a value you can always add to something so the value doesn't change. Once again, we could use, let's use capital A here. A plus 0 equals 0 plus A equals A. That's an example of the additive identity in that the values are not changing even though we're adding something to it. Keeping that in mind, we move down to another value involving a 0. This one's multiplying. You can probably guess. Multiplying and zeros. That's pretty easy to tell. So let's multiply something by 0. You would have liked this one way back in 2nd grade when you learn your multiplication facts. Anything times 0 is 0. So we can generically say a times 0 is the same as 0 times a, which are equivalent statements, of course, and that equals 0. So that's a multiplicative property of 0. We have the additive identity up here, which is similar to it. And then finally, only because it's mentioned, even though it's not discussed in the questions themselves, these three properties are one that you should be familiar with. As a quick reminder, the commutative property of equality, I'm just going to double check something here. The commutative property is if you have three things, let's say in order 1 plus 2 plus 3, and it works for adding and multiplying, as does this one. You can change the order of two of the numbers. So instead of 1, 2, 3, you can do 1 and 3 and 2. And with adding and multiplying, you're allowed to do that. The associative property might let you do something like this. If you took those same numbers again, 1 plus 2 plus 3, but you had a group of two of them, but for some reason you wanted to group that differently, and we'll talk about why that might be the case in class, you can simply take the parentheses and shift them to another part of the question as long as you're dealing with just adding or multiplying. So 1 plus 2 plus 3. Notice the difference between the two. The commutative property, the order changes. In the associative property, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, the order doesn't change, but the grouping symbols do. And then finally, sometimes confused with the associative property is the distributive property. When you have something like 3 times, let's say, 4 plus 10, the distributive property is the same as 3 times 4 and 3 times 10. You would have seen your teachers in the past draw an arc like this, or maybe they made an arrow out of it to try to show you multiplication. 3 times 4 is 12, 3 times 10 is 30, and 12 and 30 make 42. So that's an example of using the distributive property to do a multiplication problem, which was really the same as 3 times 14. So this is a way that if I were tutoring someone that was learning how to multiply 1-digit by 2-digit numbers, I would teach them the traditional techniques with carrying and stacking, but I would also teach them this as well. You'll see more properties as we go, but for now, that is all you need for Section 1-4.